Okay. Just going to go ahead and say right off the bat, this is not going to be a normal episode. I am not doing the standard intro and all that. Here is why. All of you, I am 100% certain, have seen the horror show that is going on in the Middle East right now. And the easiest thing in the world to do would be for me to just run this like a regular episode, make some commentary on it, and roll on from there. But that is not what we need to do as a society. Yes, I realize there's only a handful of people who listen to this podcast, so it's not like I'm going to make a huge shift in the world. But at the same fucking time, how the shit that we're seeing on the news from the Middle East right now becomes normalized, becomes something that we all just think we gotta live with, is by people just treating it the way they would do any other news story. And we should have learned something by now about why that is wrong. Because the people comparing this to 9/11 are not wrong. Remember, Bin Laden's idea with 9/11 was that he was going to cause us to do shit that would destroy ourselves. That is absolutely what Hamas is trying to do in Israel. And to some extent, it seems to be working. I mean, there is obviously no justification for what Hamas has done. And forget the conflicting reports we hear about what's going on there. You know, oh, they murdered all these people. Oh, actually, no, they didn't murder all these people. Oh, wait, they did. You know, back and forth, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how horrific it is. This was an attack that was clearly designed to provoke an overwhelming response. Not because they thought, oh, well, we'll just do this and we'll be able to destroy Israel. No, but because they knew that this would radicalize people on all sides of the issue. Both pro-Palestinian, both pro-Israeli, both that's what they want. They want radicalism, they want violence, they want death, and they want destruction. And this isn't to say that Israel shouldn't defend itself. Obviously they should. But they need to think about the manner in which they do so. Because regardless of where one stands on the issues of Palestine and Israel, we recognize it's a war zone. What the fuck happens in war zone? People get traumatized. What happens when people are traumatized? They quite often inflict their trauma on other people. So, what Hamas has done, and Israel's government under Bibi Netanyahu has done, has ensured that there is now another generation of people horrifically traumatized by these events. So they're ensuring a perpetuation of the cycle, whether it is in 20 years, we'll be generous and say it'll be that long before something this bad happens again, where Palestinians attack Israelis or Israelis attack Palestinians. It doesn't matter. They've ensured a greater likelihood of that happening because of the level of trauma that has been inflicted upon the people of Palestine and Israel. And I have seen far, far too many people saying that, well, the response by Israel needs to be basically fucking genocide against the Palestinians. And those comments have been made by people whom I would normally consider to be rational, who would have enough sense to say, you know, we need to think about how we're dealing with this. We need to do things differently. That's what I find most appalling. And I'm not trying to minimize the horrors, the genocidal horrors. Let me you put that out there, because that's what's going on there in Israel and Palestine, and that is on both sides. Yes, I know. On both siding things, and both siding shit is often wrong. In this case, I don't think it is. And you know, when you boil it all down, the reason this war has gone on for decades boils entirely down to religion. Because, let's face it, that's what's involved here. When we have wars that are largely considered to be secular in origin, say World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they don't quite go on like this, like what we're seeing in the Middle East. And it needs to be pointed out that Israel is bombing Syria and Lebanon, in addition to Gaza and potentially the West Bank. Yes, there is some justification for some of the attacks. Obviously, if there's a supply base for Hamas in another country, you might want to blow it up if Hamas is attacking your country. Get that. Absolutely get that. But the shit that Israel is doing in Gaza, I can't agree with some of it. Obviously, again, they have the right to defend themselves. It's the manner in which they are doing so that I take issue with. And just as both Hamas and other forces out there have wanted, it has spread outside of the Middle East. Sure, you've all heard about that fucker who murdered a little kid and seriously injured that child's mother. There is no fucking excuse for that, even if you think every Palestinian in the Middle East is to blame for what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. There's no excuse for murdering a little fucking kid. And apparently, that child saw the landlord who murdered him as a grandfatherly figure and ran to him to hug him, only to wind up being stabbed to death. But that's the kind of shit Hamas wants. They want people to act violently against Muslims and people from the Middle East, like Palestinians and Israelis, and, you know, just about any group you can name over there, because let's face it, there are Palestinian Christians, there are almost certainly Palestinian Buddhists, there's Palestinian atheists, you know, there's Palestinian Muslims, there's Israeli Palestinians. I mean, they're Palestinian ethnically, but their citizenship is Israel. You know, and of course there's all kinds of atheists and Jews and Christians who are also Israeli. They are using religion to create a nightmare, and they are being exploited by opportunists in other parts of the world. Reportedly, Hamas met with Putin twice this year before the attacks. Well, not with Putin, but with members of the Russian government who are, basically, if you're meeting with a high-level Russian government official, you're doing it with Putin's approval. Putin's goal, he had to have helped on this. Because what did a bunch of Republicans do in Congress as soon as this shit happened? They all said, well, we got to cut off funding for Ukraine so we can send it to Israel. Again, no reason for us not to send Israel aid if they need it. I would also argue that we need to send Palestinians humanitarian aid. But the United States has the largest military budget on the goddamn planet. Something like the next 10 nations combined have smaller military expenditures than the U.S. does. We can afford to give Israel and Ukraine whatever the fuck they want and not impact our defense, not impact our economy in any way at all. But the Republicans know that people are stupid. Well, people who vote for Republicans are stupid. So they can say, oh gosh, we can't let Ukraine have the aid. Israel needs it. Well, who's that help? Doesn't necessarily help, Israel, because they may not need that shit. Definitely helps Hamas and definitely helps Russia in their war against Ukraine. And these situations are not remotely comparable to one another. Because if you look at the population, depending on how you break the numbers down of Israel and Palestine, they're roughly equal in population size. The numbers get hairy because it all depends on who's considered a Palestinian, who's not. But, basically, they're close in size. Russia's population is like 100 million plus. Ukraine's population isn't anywhere near that size. Ukraine doesn't have the kind of military that Russia has. And it's not like Ukraine and Russia have spent the past 70 fucking years blowing each other up over religious issues. We all know why Russia invaded Ukraine, because Putin was trying to distract people from the fact that he can't run a fucking country. Hamas started this shit with Israel because Israel was trying to make peace with Saudi Arabia. We can forget the shit about, what an awful country Saudi Arabia is, and just think about the fact that who is Saudi Arabia's biggest rival, or one of their largest rivals in that region? Iran. So Iran apparently has done a few things to help with this, because it's to Iran's advantage if Saudi Arabia and Israel aren't pals anymore, or don't become pals. I mean, not like they're ever going to be really chummy to begin with, because, let's face it. But the Saudi Arabia absolutely needs to improve their image. That's why they bought the fucking golf tournaments in the U.S., because they're trying to whitewash their image. Oh, no, we're not a terrible country. We don't repress women. We don't do all this. We don't murder journalists. We don't imprison people who have mild disagreements with the government or the religion. And, we have to, I know people are going to say I'm crazy about this, but we are now in World War III. Probably should have declared it when Russia invaded Ukraine, but now you got to realize we are in a global war situation. We've got Russia, Ukraine fighting one another, and the NATO powers pouring weapons into Ukraine so that Ukraine can defend itself. We've got Armenia and Azerbaijan going to war with one another, and I have not talked about that. I would have loved to have talked about that, but with all the shit that's been going around here, I think you can understand why I've skipped a few things. We've got Israel, Gaza, Israel, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, and Turkey's going to get into it with somebody. India may get into it with Pakistan. I don't know. But there are all these nations fighting one another, and the U.S., NATO, Russia, and others are either actively fighting or they're supporting the people who are fighting. Nobody wants to call it World War III because everybody's like, oh my God, if we call it World War III, then somebody's going to use nukes. Honestly, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the closest we've come to an actual nuclear war since World War II has been when Pakistan and India both demonstrated that they have nuclear weapons. Nobody wants to use nukes. If you look at the history of the Cold War, you will find that there are numerous instances that we know about where if people followed protocol, they would have launched nukes. In every case that we know about, none of them did. All of them said, wait a minute, before I unleash what will certainly be an extinction level event, I'm going to make sure that this is the appropriate response. And the reason why I say that we know about is because absolutely certain there were other instances where we almost, wiped ourselves out because this or that nation thought that some other nation had launched nukes and we're going to scramble and respond with nukes, but something happened and they didn't, and we just haven't heard about it yet because they don't like to talk about these things. They don't want to scare us to let us realize, oh my God, we came within 2 seconds of missiles being launched or planes being launched or bombs being dropped. Because if we knew how close we came at some point, certain points in time, we might very well decide, hey, this society system that we have created for ourselves, the social structure that we all belong to, regardless of whether we're an American or a Russian or a Soviet or a Chinese or whatever, has some flaws and it needs to be dealt with. Remember how during the pandemic, Trump and his people kept trying to play it down. And they did that not merely because they didn't know what to fucking do because they're incompetent boobs, but also because they realized at some level, if they acknowledged this, people would begin to question shit about the way our society was structured. I mean, think about all the people going back to work since they stopped treating COVID as seriously as they had. You know, you've got people who are like, well, fuck you. I can do remote work. I'm not going back into the office. And I don't care that my current employer says I have to be there. I will find somebody else who lets me do remote work. You have people going into the office, you know, realizing, hey, I'm not busting my ass for these assholes and not getting anything for my own. And we have, I've mentioned this before, I know. For the first time in human history, in the entirety of our species, we've been here, Homo sapiens sapiens have been here for somewhere between 300,000 and 250,000 years, okay? For the first time in our history, not only do we have large numbers of literate people? I mean, you know, you think about biblical times, you know, we'll go with 1st century CE. It's probably in the Middle East, 1% of the population that was literate. I have no idea what the numbers were in other parts of the world, but they probably weren't significantly higher. We are pushing, you know, better than 50% globally as far as literacy goes now. Obviously, in some nations it's higher, other nations it's lower. We also have the ability for anyone, literally anywhere on the goddamned planet, to post something, to create something, to put their thoughts down, either in words, audio, or video, and have it be seen by everyone else on the fucking planet who has a smartphone and a connection to the internet. That is mind-blowing. Because, again, most of human history has been written by a very small number of people. And it colors our view of the past. And I'm not trying to minimize the work of historians and anthropologists and archaeologists and all those types by any stretch of the imagination. But the only accounts we have of what life was like in, for example, ancient Egypt comes from a very small sliver of the population. And it doesn't matter how well those individuals may have tried to capture an accurate view of their world at that time. It is vastly different than being able to, say you have a time machine, you go back and you meet an ordinary citizen of Egypt in the time of King Tut. What would they tell us that we don't know about life in Egypt at that period in time? Who the fuck knows? Now, however, we can talk to anybody. I know this for a fact. Since at least the year 2000, probably sooner, you can make phone calls to any number on the planet from Antarctica. No shit. And now, with smartphones and all kinds of satellite communication that we have, anybody can do that with enough money. And it doesn't take a huge amount of money to be able to do that. I mean, for basically the same price that you can buy a high-end smartphone, be it, the latest iPhone or the latest Samsung Galaxy or the latest Pixel or whatever, you can buy a satellite phone. You will pay $1 a minute for every phone call you make on that. And if people call you, they may pay more than that, but that's another story. But it's $1 a minute. You could be literally anywhere on planet Earth with an Iridium satellite phone, and you can make a call to anywhere else on the Earth for not a hell of a lot of money, considering what that shit used to cost 20 years ago, and considering the fact that 40 years ago, you couldn't even do things like that. Cell phones weren't even really a thing. And we have all these various social networks on the web. And if you notice, all of them have been doing away with being able to see things in real time. The argument that the tech bros will make is, no, man, trust me. People want the algorithmic feed. They don't want a chronological feed. This ignores the fact that for years now, most of these networks have used the algorithmic feed as the default, with chronological being optional. And as time has gone by, they've made it harder and harder to find the chronological feed. Again, their argument is, well, people just don't want that. They keep using the algorithm. 3 words, excuse me. Tyranny, 4 words. Tyranny of the default. Why was Internet Explorer the largest used browser in the world during the late 90s, early 2000s? Because it came with Windows. It was set up as the default. Most people were on Windows. Most people just went with what was there. Some assholes, such as myself, realized Microsoft's kind of a shitty company. I'm going to use a different browser. You want to know how long I have avoided using Microsoft's default browser? I will tell you, and this is how I date myself. I fucking paid for Internet Explorer. Not Internet Explorer, excuse me, Netscape, which was the great grandpappy, basically, of Firefox. If you're a PC user until maybe a decade or so ago, odds are you were using Internet Explorer as your browser. If you were a Mac user, odds are you were using Safari as your web browser until maybe a decade ago. If you have an iPhone, odds are your browser is Safari. If you are an Android user, odds are the browser on your phone that you use is Chrome. So for the tech bros to say, oh no, people want algorithmic feeds, not chronological feeds, is bullshit, because they've made the algorithmic feeds the default for a long time now in many cases. And, for example, with Facebook, if you try to use, they supposedly let you use the chronological feed, but they make it basically unusable. And, Facebook, or not Facebook, but Twitter, goddamn, it's just all kinds of fucked up shit because Elon bought it. Elon bought and blew $44 billion on Twitter. Why? Well, you know how Twitter got started? And they weren't originally called Twitter. I forget what the company's name is. But basically, they were sitting there, and they were a tech company, and they were like, shit's gone wrong. Our what we were doing, because they were a podcasting platform. They're like, we're not making the kind of money off of this that we need to. We're going to have to find something else, or we're going to have to get rid of the company, just kill the company. And one of the guys who was, wait for it, an activist, said, I've got this thing that we've been playing around with. Maybe you want to try it out. That thing was Twitter. And the idea was to be able for you to easily, if you were, say, an activist and some shit was going down, so you'd whip out your phone, send basically a text message to anybody in your network, letting them know what's going on. So you could say, hey, look, cops are beating some old black guy to death. We got to do something about that. Send. Suddenly there's protests. There's all these people gathered. Well, of course, that's not how Twitter was seen by a lot of people when it really hit, the market. It was a way for us to talk to, like, celebrities, and them to talk to us, and us to talk to our friends in a different manner than what you could do on Facebook. And then 9 years ago, cops in Ferguson, Missouri, murdered Michael Brown. And the African American population in the city said, fuck this shit, we're kind of tired of it. And an awful lot of them got on Twitter and started posting shit that was going on in Ferguson. None of the news media, not even the local stuff, was covering what was happening there. And people took notice. All kinds of people signed up to Twitter because they wanted to keep up with what was going on, or they wanted to show what was going on. And then we had the pandemic. People were locked at home, and they started using social networks to keep in touch with friends and family and coworkers and all that. And they started being able to talk to one another in real time. They started seeing what their lives were like. Additionally, they started seeing what the lives of the wealthy were actually like. Remember all those videos with the various celebrities soaking in their hot tubs saying, we're all in the same boat. We just need to stay home and just, do this time so that we can beat this pandemic. And a lot of people were sitting there going, motherfucker, your bathroom is bigger than my entire apartment. And they started seeing, that the wealthy weren't bothered by this shit, but all of us were. And we all started talking to one another, and we made jokes. We said things like, eat the rich or whatever. We weren't really serious, but we were just making jokes. And then we started really thinking, hey, maybe this isn't right. I'm dying here, basically. And this asshole, whom I can't stand for whatever reason, is living in the lap of luxury. And we start seeing all this shit about, and the wealthy people get their loans forgiven, yet we can't get, government checks, stimulus checks, or whatever you want to call those things that they were handing out during the pandemic. Obviously, countries outside the U.S. got a lot better deal than we Americans did. But we all started seeing that shit, and we started talking. And then, they declared the pandemic over. By the way, folks, it's not, and the numbers are increasing as to COVID cases. We're not at the point where we're putting bodies in fucking refrigerated trucks yet, because there's no room in the morgue for them. But if we're not careful, we're going to get there again. And we saw people using the tools of social media to organize, not merely things to keep us entertained during the pandemic, but after the pandemic, that's how unions started making a growth, because people said, hey, this is some bullshit. We need something. And other folks are like, hey, what you need is a union because it'll prevent this and this from happening. So people started joining unions. They started saying, hey, you know what? You don't have to work a shitty job like that. Go ahead and quit it, because if enough, they're begging for people to come back. So fucking quit, find something else, do things, make things better for yourself. And we started questioning the social order. The serfs got angry. And the billionaires realized, oh, fuck, we got to do something or they're going to kill us. So that's when they really started fucking with the social networks. That's when Musk bought Twitter and promptly trashed it. He's ruined the things that you could use to try and get reliable information out of Twitter. And he's not sweating the fact that the company is just cratering in terms of value and ad revenue and all that shit, because his goal wasn't to make money with it. His goal, and the goal of all those people who backed him on this, because he did not do it alone, was to prevent us from using Twitter and other social networks as a tool to unite ourselves and bring about equality in this world. If they can manipulate the communication networks, then they can do shit. Anybody who's got a steady diet of Fox News can tell you all kinds of bugfuck conspiracy shit that they are certain is true. And organizations like Fox and all these others, they guide you down pathways. No, Fox News is not going to give you the most bugfuck conspiracy theories out there. But you know what? They're going to point you in the direction of the folks who are. I mean, look at what Rupert Murdoch's empire consists of. He's got shitty tabloids like the New York Post and the Sun and who the fuck else knows what in the rest of the world. I mean, he owns shit in Australia and he owns shit in the UK and he owns shit here and he owns shit elsewhere, I'm sure. But you get my point. He's got shitty tabloids everywhere, basically, in the English-speaking world. He's also got somewhat well, they were really respectable before he bought them, not that they necessarily should have been, and they certainly shouldn't be now, but people still give them credit. Publications like the Wall Street Journal. And he's got stuff in Australia. I don't know what all he owns there, but he owns, semi-respectable stuff in the UK. I'm sure he owns shit in Canada. And you notice he dumped the entertainment division of Fox. He sold that off to Disney, and now Disney's like, we don't know what we're going to do with any of this shit. You would, you would think if the entertainment division, which, let's face it, Disney makes billions off of the shit they bought up from Fox. Because before Disney bought Marvel and Fox, the rights for Marvel properties were scattered amongst a number of different companies. You had Sony has the rights to Spider-Man. Fox had the rights to the X-Men characters, and Marvel had the rights to everything else, and there's all kinds of complicated negotiations that have to happen, before Disney bought Fox, there were all kinds of complicated negotiations that would have to happen to have a character that was in a Fox Marvel movie in a Disney Marvel movie. Same thing is true with Spider-Man and the various characters that Sony has of Marvels showing up in a Marvel movie that's produced by Disney. You can dig into the details. They're hugely complicated and they're not obvious as to who owns what where. But Rupert had enough money he could buy Marvel, I'm sure. Marvel paid $4 billion, or Disney paid $4 billion for Marvel and $4 billion for Star Wars. Rupert Murdoch is worth $17 billion. As Bill Gates has said, once you hit a certain point, and that point is $100 million, money loses all meaning because it doesn't matter what you want to do or how much money you have. You can do it because if you don't have enough money, people will fucking give it to you when you're that wealthy. Yeah, sure, maybe it's a loan, maybe it's not, but you can do it. Maybe you have, you have to have business partners, but they can be minority partners and you can work that shit out so that it's easy to buy them out later on if you want to. If the entertainment division was something that was really important to Rupert, he never would have sold it to Disney. He kept the news shit, which everybody was like, well, that's all failing and losing money. Uh-huh, sure, maybe it is, but it gives him a massive amount of influence. It enabled him to elect at least 2 different presidents, W and Trump. And if the Fox empire isn't destroyed, he'll get another president. Well, he may not live long enough, but his children, who are running the Fox News division, will. That should scare the fuck out of all of you. And, he bought MySpace. Fucking ruined that shit. At one point in time, I don't know if it's still the case, owned a bunch of Facebook stock. So did some Russians. We are on the cusp of a social revolution, the kind of which has not been seen on this planet in perhaps millennia, if ever. Us ordinary folks being able to talk to one another, not just in our little town or in our state or in our country, but literally around the planet, enables us to see what things are like elsewhere in the world. And yes, there is going to be upheavals and disruptions because of that. If, however, that communication is allowed to happen without interference, without manipulation, we're going to see a more equitable world created. Because we will realize that those people over in this other country that we've been told to hate, or have been told that, well, yeah, they may be all our allies or whatever, but they're still not as free as us. We're going to realize we've been lied to about all kinds of things. I'll give a great example. They'll sit there and they'll say, oh, well, America, you can see a doctor whenever you want because we don't have socialized medicine. And in any country where you have socialized medicine, they're rationing care. This is fucking bullshit. Because what happens is, in the United States, if you don't have insurance, you don't get to see a doctor most times. Even if you do have insurance, you probably still aren't going to see a doctor because you can't afford it. It doesn't matter if it's just simply the cost of the copay, or if you have a serious illness, you can't afford it even with the medical bills or even with insurance because of what's left over. And they will say, oh my God, you know, this person had to wait 6 weeks to have knee replacement surgery because of socialized medicine. But you know what? The poorest motherfucker in that country can walk into the hospital, say, hey, I need knee replacement surgery, and they'll eventually get it. In America, the poorest person who needs knee replacement surgery has no hope of getting it, ever, because they either don't have insurance, or even if they do have insurance, they don't have the money to pay for it. 500,000 Americans or more die prematurely every year because of how shitty our healthcare system is. Think about that. There is this old guy, and when I say old, I mean he appears to be 60s or later. I can't really tell because I only encounter this guy at night when I'm coming home from work, whatever. And I've seen him, a handful of times over the past couple of years. When I say couple of years, I'm like 2 or 3, right? Last time I ran into him, well, the past 2 times I've ran into him, I should say. He told me sort of the same story. One, he's homeless and he's living in his truck that he's parked in a vacant lot. Believable. I know where the lot is. There's a truck there. He might very well be living in it. I don't know. Don't really fucking care. He showed me his leg. He's got this nasty, ugly looking thing on his leg. Says he's a diabetic and that, they're trying to take his foot because of the infection. He's unemployed. He doesn't have any money. He can't get treatment. All they can do is take his foot. They can't give him insulin because, he can't afford it. Last time I ran into him, he told me that, and he told me he had colon cancer and only 6 months to live. Is he bullshitting me? I don't fucking know. Don't fucking care. If I have money, when I see him and he asks me for it, I give it to him. 60-some-odd-year-old man. Doesn't have a job. Apparently, he's begging. Give him $10 or whatever. What the fuck? Maybe he's conning me. He's certainly not wealthy pretending to be poor like that. He's definitely somebody who's poor. Right? I mean, even if he's not living in that truck, even if he's living in a house, he ain't living in no fucking mansion. He ain't living fancy. And he's certainly not of an age where he can easily find a decent paying job, regardless of what his skill set is. So I don't care if he's telling me the truth. It's like Mary Lou Retton. Maybe you've heard this or not. Her daughter got on social media and said, Mom's in the hospital. She's got this an unusual case of pneumonia. It's not, she doesn't have insurance. She's about to be bankrupt. And there are people who are in the know. And when I say in the know, I'm talking about people who, they know somebody who knows Mary Lou Retton. So they can make a phone call and find out the truth. And they have said, we're not sure about this. This might be a grift. Okay. The reason that grift works to begin with is the fact that we don't have socialized medicine in the United States. Because that's what they're asking for. They're asking to help pay her medical bills. If we had socialized medicine and her kids or she wanted to do a grift, they couldn't use the medical excuse. They'd have to come up with something else. That makes it a little bit harder to pull the grift. And the thing that I am trying to do with the stuff that I'm putting out for the Patreons right now is I'm trying to explain how some of the manipulation is being done by those who want to manipulate us, and how dangerous it is, and how AI software can play a role in that. And that's even if you think that AI software that we have today is nothing more than spicy autocorrect, okay? Forget whether or not AI is smart as humans or smarter than humans or anything like that. As those who've listened to the bonus stuff I put out on Patreon will know, there are hooks in human psychology that people can pick and use to manipulate us. And with AI, it gets a lot easier, even if AI is, again, nothing more than spicy autocorrect. And I am seriously worried, because if the oligarchs win this round, we're done as a species. We're done as a civilization, because the oligarchs can only grasp their world that they live in. They can't grasp what things are like for the rest of us. And to be fair, this is not simply a condition that exists amongst the oligarchs. It exists amongst all of us to some degree or another. But unlike the oligarchs, most of us don't have the ability to buy entire fucking governments or hire your own private army to wage war against somebody you don't fucking like. I mean, all you have to do to get an idea of what kind of weird bubble every one of us lives in, just go to BuzzFeed and do a search on, their lists for things like, strange shit men say about women, or things Americans are surprised about when they go to foreign countries, or things foreigners are surprised about the U.S., stuff along those lines. And I guarantee you will see shit, and you'll see enough of it. It's like, okay, maybe one of these or a couple of these is fake, but there's so much of this shit out there that it can't all be fake. Where people don't understand things that you would think a normal person would, regardless of their gender or where they live or whatever. I'm not kidding. I mean, you just look at all the things that women say, or men say about women, or women have said that men have said to them, and you're like, my God, did you not have basic biology? There are a disturbing number, and by disturbing, I mean more than one, men out there who think women can control when they have their period. It's not how it works. And there's all kinds of things that you would expect people to understand, but they don't, because it's not because they're stupid or something like that necessarily. It's because they haven't been exposed to things outside their world. The oligarchs think we're happy living like this, scratching out a living. Or that we've chosen this either because we're just too stupid to know how to be a billionaire, or because we'd rather be poor. They don't think about the fact that, oh yeah, it sure helps that you had a wealthy family and you got to go to this high dollar college and you met all these people, and somebody could afford to give you, you've got an idea for business. Who knows if it'll succeed or fail, but you need, a huge chunk of change, and the person who gives that huge chunk of change to you isn't going to miss it if things fail. I mean, I can tell you right now, if I knew somebody who had a good chunk of change, and who, maybe they didn't have as much as necessary, but they knew enough people who would have enough money necessary that they could afford to invest it, I could revolutionize industries. I mean, granted, I don't know enough to be able to work out a good prospectus with all kinds of mathematical details that people would need. But I know enough about the industries and things like that I can make a good case to somebody who could give me access to those people. We could make billions. We could change the world. Of course, the problem with that is, and we're going to circle back around here a little bit. What happens? I mean, you give me what Rupert Murdoch is worth, $17 billion? Fucking A. I will transform this goddamn planet in ways that people could not imagine. I can revolutionize the auto industry and at the same time, not merely revolutionize the auto industry, but I can also help marginalized communities easily. And what started happening with the .com boom? Well, you got people who there were a handful of folks who really didn't have much and suddenly got lucky and started making money, and they started changing things, and that upset people because where wealth started being concentrated shifted a little bit. Okay, so obviously the families that have generational wealth for decades or longer now haven't been reduced to poverty, but now suddenly financial centers in the world haven't necessarily shifted so much. I mean, obviously, because New York has been a financial center of the world since part of the 20th century. Same thing with London. Same thing with, a few other markets. I've never had enough money to worry about shit like that, so I don't really know. I can remember seeing, London Stock Exchange and New York Stock Exchange, but there was, you've got big stock market exchanges in New York, Chicago, London, and there are ones elsewhere in the world. But suddenly, more places started cropping up where there was a large concentration of wealth, and they started being able to influence things. One of the reasons after my parents' divorce, my dad moved down here was because it was an impoverished area. And, with what he had accumulated over the years while he was married to my mother, he could move here and leverage that to a higher social status than he had back home in Ohio. And one of the problems that he ran into that he didn't realize is that there's two kinds of money in this world. There is old money and there is new money, or as they called it in the 80s, nouveau riche. Newly rich. Well, if you were old money, meaning your wealth was inherited, not that you earned it by a business or whatever, you had a higher level of status than somebody who had a business and made their money. They were poor, they started a business and they made their money. And, maybe the folks running in the country club were only worth a couple of million and you were worth 30 million, but because the folks in the country club had inherited their money and didn't work for it, they consider themselves better than those who worked for their money, more or less, and wound up being worth $30 million. And then you get Reagan in there in the 80s with all these tax cuts and shit, and suddenly the number of wealthy people explodes, as does the number of poor people. So some of the differences between old money and new money got erased at that point. But at the same time, the really wealthy, started getting upset because these newer wealthy folks just had different ideas. And, we're not talking like, oh, the newly wealthy are going to give all their money away to the poor or whatever. No, it's just that they decided they wanted to make money in things other than what had traditionally been done. And that was unseemingly. If Trump had been smart, he could have gotten himself established as old money because he inherited his wealth from his father. But he's not smart, and so he just was seen as this newly brash guy. The guy who put Trump on the Fortune 500 list for the first time, he says, thing he realizes now that he didn't know back then is that the people who were actually worth large amounts of money, they didn't want to discuss it. They didn't want, they didn't want people to know what they were worth. Trump was more than happy to ensure that that reporter knew what Trump said he was worth. And, the oligarchs are happy if you are wealthy and you're not going to disrupt the apple cart that they're all profiting off of. But if we live in a world where anybody can become a billionaire, that makes things complicated. Because you don't know what they're going to do with that money. Sure, some of them are just going to fuck off to a tropical island and, dissipate their lives with drugs, alcohol, or whatever. But others of them are going to, they're going to disrupt things. They're going to make things difficult for people in other areas. Elon Musk, for example. Nobody took electric cars seriously until Tesla came along, and then he bought into them and really hyped them up. Lest you think I'm joking about this, if you go back to the early days of the automobile, late 1800s, early 1900s, okay, Ferdinand Porsche's first car that he ever built was a hybrid. It was in like 1899. Up until about 1930, there were commercial trucks that were hybrids. Why? Because the gasoline engines of the era weren't powerful enough when compared to the electric motors that were available, so that's what they used. And then the price of gasoline fell, and there were some minor improvements in automotive technology in terms of the internal combustion engine and diesels and things like that, and that enabled them to switch over to all, non-hybrid vehicles. Had we forget the whole thing about, they're like, people talk about, in the early 1900s, electric cars outsold gasoline power. That's meaningless because battery technology is far more complicated than internal combustion engine technology, and there's simply no way that we could have made really dramatic leaps in battery technology on the level that we made with internal combustion engine technology at that point in time. However, had we simply gone with hybrids from the beginning, and there are good reasons for us to have done that, not merely fuel economy and environmental reasons, but for simplicity's sake. There are ways that it sounds counterintuitive. I know there are ways that hybrid cars are simpler than internal combustion cars, because if you do things right, you can have a very compact, tiny little internal combustion engine that powers an electric motor and batteries, and you get vastly superior performance. But for complicated reasons that I'm not going to go into, because we're now well over the hour mark, that didn't happen, right? But had it happened, had we just stuck with hybrid technology, the world would be vastly different today. Elon comes in, buys Tesla, and hypes it up, and boom, 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 suddenly everybody's got to do something, either a hybrid or an electric vehicle or, a fuel cell vehicle. They've got to do something. You know what? You give me $1 billion, I'll wreck the auto industry as we know it. Everybody who, regardless of what you think about automobiles, would be like, oh, wait, no, this is actually a great idea. Because when we think of the history of the automobile, do we think of Ferraris? Well, sure. Yeah, you think of Ferraris because they're really fast cars. But what cars changed things for billions, literally billions of people on this planet? There were things like the Model T, the VW Beetle, the Citroën 2CV, and there were others, of course, but those three I'm just going to mention off the top of my head that I can think of. Well, why did they change billions of people's lives? It wasn't merely that these cars were cheap. That certainly was a part of it. But all of these cars had something else in common. They could be easily modified by their owners to suit them in ways that the manufacturers didn't support. Right? So, there is a big deal made out of the fact that the Model T, the first Model Ts in 1908, when they were released, they were flex-fueled vehicles. They could run off of gasoline and ethanol, or a combination. May have even been able to run off of kerosene, I don't remember. And then, like a year or so later, they were dropped down to just running on gasoline. Forget that. But what did people do with the Model Ts when they bought them? There were people who, that was a significant investment. That was their, that showed they made it. They kept the vehicle pristine. Other people, they bought it and they're like, you know what? I need a tractor. This Model T is cheaper than a tractor, and I can easily modify it to be a tractor for me. And so they did it. Or because there were so many of the things produced, like the Model T or the VW Beetle, they said, you know what? This is nowhere near what I want, but it is a good foundation for me to make what I want. So, and it's dirt cheap. I will buy it and make what I want with it. If you are someone who, has been around for 50 or so more years, you will remember that in like the 60s and the 70s and part of the 80s, there were kit cars all over the place. You could buy fiberglass body parts, take a VW Beetle or another car, but we'll go with the VW Beetle, chop the body off, and then put these fiberglass things on, and suddenly you had a car that looked nothing like the VW Beetle. Of course, it didn't make the VW Beetle sound as it ran, but hey, it looked nothing like a VW Beetle. Doubt me? Google a Bradley GT. That's a VW Beetle with a fiberglass body. Doesn't look like it. And if you halfway knew what you were doing, you could take that Bradley GT with the VW Beetle engine in it, and you could pop that VW Beetle engine out and bolt up a Porsche engine to it. Now, suddenly that fucker is fast, and it doesn't sound like even though it's using an air-cooled engine. It's just using an air-cooled engine made by Porsche and not VW. And I know how you can do that with electric vehicles. I know how you can, and I don't know who did this at Tesla, but it's the idea. It's the right idea. Okay, here is a thing that people, and it doesn't matter the industry, you can verify this anywhere. If a bargain basement brand, Sam's Choice from Walmart, or Archer Farms from Target, or Kia or Hyundai tries to go upmarket, they don't want to be the low price leader. They want to make this extravagant, expensive thing, luxurious item. They can't sell it under the name Sam's Choice or Archer Farms or Kia or whatever. Because everybody looks at it, it's like, it's a cheap piece of shit or garbage or whatever. I'm not paying that much for it. But if you have a high-end brand, say Mercedes, and you suddenly make a model that is inexpensive, people are like, wait, I can get a Mercedes for less than $50 or $75 or $100,000? Oh my God, that's fantastic. I want that. Or a BMW or whatever. It's easier for an upscale brand to go down market than it is for a down market brand to go upscale. So by Tesla starting out making really expensive vehicles and then gradually dropping the price of their vehicles, they keep the glamour of the high price while dropping the low price, dropping to a lower price. Whereas if you're a low-end brand and you want to go up, you really can't. It's really hard. So if you're a low-end brand and you want to make big profits off of what you're selling, you can't sell it under your brand name. Because, trust me, I've worked in the automotive industry at multiple levels. I mean, obviously, I've never been an executive or, management, but I've worked at enough levels and I've researched the issue enough to know. The profit margins on the high-end vehicles are fucking insane compared to the low-end vehicles. For complicated reasons that have to do in part because of how stupid corporations are, car companies have a hard time making a big profit off of a small car. Unless there's somebody like VW, where they may not make as much. Well, VW, from the end of World War II until, say, about the 90s. You can build a small car. You won't make a lot of money off each individual car, but because you're selling so many cars, you make a massive profit. If you're, a high-end brand, you're making a massive amount of profit off of each individual car. So it doesn't matter if you only sell a tenth of what the VW Beetle does, you're bringing in way more money. But yeah, if some fucking billionaire out there were to lose their senses and to come to me and say, heard you know something about cars, I could tell them how they could create a brand of high-end luxury electric vehicles that, would sell to really wealthy pricks just fine. And at the same time, the same fucking technology could be used in dirt cheap, basically Model T or VW Beetle versions of electric cars that anybody out there, even somebody making a minimum wage, could afford. It can be done easy if you know what to do. But now think about what happens if some billionaire were to do that and, show up, tell me, okay, I'll pay for all your shit, you do whatever you want to do, and we got stupidly rich. What do you think I'm going to do? Okay, I will confess, I'm an asshole. So a tropical island stocked with half-naked women, gonna appeal to me. Probably do something like that. Maybe not quite so misogynistic, but, you got money, man. You're gonna do something with it. But at the same time, I am gonna be throwing money at marginalized communities to help them out, to help people who have been in situations like I've been, or worse, have a decent life. Well, that scares the wealthy. Because understand, it is really hard to come up with a good idea. It doesn't matter the field, the industry, or whatever. It is hard. It is a lot easier if you've got money to structure things so you don't have to constantly come up with good ideas. Everybody complains, and they're not wrong about this, about the fact that, all we're getting are these sequels, franchise movies, reboots, and it's all shit like Star Wars and Marvel and DC and who knows what. And it's not that you dislike that shit, but come on, man. You want to do a superhero movie? Great. But give me somebody different than I've seen a billion times before. Well, that's hard to do. One of the things that... Here's the reason why they do sequels and reboots. It's because a lot of your marketing is already done for you. Take the character of Superman. Well, you don't have to tell people a great deal about what a Superman movie or TV show is going to be about, because we've got nearly a century of, Superman comic books, TV shows, cartoons, movies, video games, etc., etc. So that's pre-sold. But imagine you're going to have a character who is not Superman, but is a superhero who has similar abilities to Superman. Well, but nobody's, you've just created this character out of whole cloth. That's a harder sell. That costs a little bit more money. Can you convince somebody who's a fan of Superman to also be a fan of this character? Maybe, maybe not. Why did Disney buy Star Wars? Because they had this, vast, established, multi-billion-dollar concept. And they could tell stories within a framework for less money than they could if they told those stories out of whole cloth. You put out a new Star Wars movie or TV show or whatever, for example, you can't guarantee that it'll be a hit, but you can guarantee you'll make some money off of it. Whereas if you have a wholly new character from scratch, that becomes a harder sell. You don't know how well it'll do. Regardless of what you might think of the film compared to the book, a perfect illustration of this is the movie Starship Troopers. You know how that came about? The movie, not the book. If you want to know how the book came about, read Heinlein's Expanded Universe, and that has some details about it. How the movie version of Starship Troopers came about was there were a couple of screenwriters in Hollywood. They went to a studio and said, we want to do a Bugs in Space movie. Studio looked at the screenwriters. They, knew their track record. They knew concept of Bugs in Space, which is sort of what Alien and the Aliens franchise is about. They knew what that did, but they said, we need something more. So those screenwriters found out that, the studio owns the movie rights to the book Starship Troopers. So we'll take our idea and graft it onto Starship Troopers, and that's how we'll get the movie. So that's what they did. Another example, the movie I, Robot with Scientologist, yes, he is a motherfucking Scientologist, Will Smith, came to be, is they wrote the movie. They had it. It had nothing to do, and those who've seen the movie will argue it still has nothing to do, but that's beside the point, with Isaac Asimov's book, I, Robot, but because there were a couple of elements that were sort of the same, they're like, we don't want to get sued by Asimov's estate, so we'll buy the film rights, slap the I, Robot title on it and put it out, change a couple of character names, blah, blah, blah. That's what happened. That's cheap. That's easy. Maybe they won't have a hit film on their hand, but they know they'll have people showing up. Whereas there are movies that literally have had tens of millions of dollars or more spent on them, and the global box office total was a fraction of what the movie's budget was. And to hedge against that, they slap I, Robot on a movie that really doesn't have anything to do with Asimov's I, Robot story. If you doubt me on this, go find, and there's all kinds of places because it's been published, and you can get copies of it because I don't think it's still in print, but you can get used copies of it fairly inexpensively, and of course you can always go pirate it. There is a screenplay adaptation written by Harlan Ellison of iRobot. Harlan Ellison wrote it because Isaac Asimov asked him to. It is vastly fucking different than the Will Smith movie. I have not seen the Will Smith movie. I am not going to comment on the quality of the Will Smith movie. I will say, however, having read the Harlan Ellison screenplay for iRobot, Harlan Ellison very explicitly says in his introduction to the screenplay, his goal in writing it was to do the Citizen Kane of science fiction movies. Now, you can argue all kinds of different things about the Will Smith movie, but I think we can all agree at the end of the day, the Will Smith movie was aiming to be a giant blockbuster film and not a deep movie. Right? And I'm not trying to talk smack about anybody in this. I think we can all agree 2001 science fiction movie, hugely influential, right? Hugely influential, but the story is not it's not an action movie. Star Wars, another science fiction, some would argue science fantasy, hugely influential, right? Maybe even more influential than 2001. But I'm sure we can all agree, regardless of what we might think of those films, they made piles of money and they dramatically changed the world. So the Will Smith version of iRobot was aiming to be another Star Wars movie. It did not achieve that, of course. Doesn't matter whether or not the movie was good. These things happen. Harlan Ellison's version of iRobot would have been, had it been made and had it, turned into a success, it would have been a 2001 type movie. Some overlap in the audiences, not a lot. But no shame in making Star Wars or in making 2001 in terms of money or cultural impact. I think you'll all agree. And, while companies, movie studios would much rather make a Star Wars that pulls in cajillions of dollars than a 2001, which makes a profit and is well respectable. Studios are all about the Benjamins, so it's not quite as good, but hey, it's still good enough. Not like the Will Smith movie that it did whatever it did, and no matter how good it wasn't good enough to create a sequel. But they knew they were going to make something off of it because they put the iRobot title on it, and they knew Asimov fans would check it out. Same with the Foundation TV series on Apple. It is very different than the books. I've read the books. I don't care if somebody likes the books but not the TV series, or likes the TV series and not the books. Doesn't matter to me. Each one is different and for different reasons. And, let's face it, you cannot easily, in many cases, adapt a book for a movie and keep everything intact. You've got to change some things for a variety of reasons. You do it right, you still end up with something everybody loves. You do it wrong, you end up with something everybody hates. The Foundation TV series? Kind of middling. But how many people would have turned in if they had called it something else, if they hadn't tied it into Asimov's Foundation series? I don't know. Nobody knows. But you tie it in with Foundation and Asimov, you're going to get people checking it out. I checked it out. Not really big on watching anything anymore for some reason, but I didn't hate it. I have some real issues with the Foundation series as written by Asimov that I didn't have when I initially read it, that, as I've gotten smarter over the decades since I read it, because goddamn Ronald Reagan was fucking president when I read it the first time. But it's not, in terms of a story, it's not horrible. Even if Asimov wasn't the greatest person. But would I have checked out those couple of episodes if it hadn't had Foundation and Asimov attached to it? I don't know. But I checked it out because I was like, well, okay, there's a possibility here. It could be really interesting. It could really address things that, whatever, were in the book or weren't in the book or were implied by the book or whatever. But like the For All Mankind series that Apple TV Plus is doing, is an alternative history where the Soviets, got to the moon before the United States, and that led to us sending an all-female crew to the moon and then going on to Mars. I haven't checked it out. I love alternate history. I don't know why. I just haven't had the urge to check it out. Maybe it's some unconscious sexism on my part. Maybe it's just because I don't watch a lot of shit anymore. I don't know. But you see where I'm going with this, right? The people who have cajillions of dollars don't want to risk any of that shit. So they do what's known as brand extension. That's why you get sequels. That's why you get shit that has a familiar title, even though the actual contents of whatever that thing is, book, movie, TV show, or whatever, don't actually match the thing that the title is supposed to imply. And while, if you hand a good chunk of people a large pile of cash, they will probably spend it in ways that benefit the current oligarchy. There's just a handful of them out there who will spend enough of it in ways that don't benefit the current oligarchy that scares the fuck out of them. I'm sure everybody has had this happen to them at some point in their life. Perhaps it's been in a work situation. Perhaps it's been in a, personal situation, whatever. But you've had this moment, or you've been involved in a moment like this, where, there is this seemingly intractable problem, right? And then somebody, maybe it's you, or maybe it's somebody in the meeting, or whatever, says something, and you realize, oh my fucking God, the solution is stupidly obvious and I couldn't see it. And I feel like a dumbass because this person pointed out to me. Now, if you're a reasonably mature adult, when that situation happens, you're like, oh, God, I can't believe I was so stupid. That's great. Fantastic. We solved this problem. Really easy. If, on the other hand, you're somebody who is terribly insecure, which a lot of oligarchs are, that's kind of why they're oligarchs, you see it as a threat. So instead of being like, oh my God, that's a fantastic idea, great, you immediately go on the attack of you attack the person who suggested it, and then, at whatever point in time you think is a reasonable amount so that everybody who's forgotten it's not really your idea, you suddenly pop out with, hey, look, I just thought of this thing and it is fan-fucking-tastic and it's going to solve all our problems. If you are listening to this podcast, you know how people react when their beliefs in religion are threatened. Because religion creates their worldview, right? Well, when, thanks to social media and the lockdowns and things like that, the oligarchs started hearing from us. And they started hearing that we don't like being poor, that we aren't doing things that make us poor, that we're not living this way by choice, but because we're forced to. How do you respond? Well, if you're a confident, secure person, you're like, hey, you've got a point. We need to address this. If, on the other hand, you're cowardly, insecure motherfucker who does not hold their position in society because of their actual accomplishments, but because of, happenstance. You happen to be born to a wealthy family, or you happen to be born in the right time, in the right place, or you're just terribly insecure. You see that as a threat. And so you're going to respond. You're going to try to crush those people as violently as crusaders crush the infidels. And that's what we're seeing. And I'll be honest, I don't have all the answers. I may not have any of the answers. But I know things have to change. That's part of the reason why I'm doing the stuff on the Patreon episodes, because I'm hoping somebody smarter than me will hear that shit and figure out something that I can't, or that enough people will be educated about the subject that perhaps we can mitigate some of the damage. I don't know. But I know I've got to try. And, this is a thing I'm going to say. I don't like mentioning it on this episode, but it needs to be done. There are two platforms that I know of that, at least as of right now, offer us serfs, us worker slaves, us plebs, us proles, us ordinary folks, an opportunity to communicate with one another, to have what we need to unify and stand against the oligarchs who are going to kill us. They will kill us because they just don't, they don't see why global warming's a big deal, because they think they can just buy their way out of it, not realizing that, the fuck you can. Shit gets real bad. You can't eat money. You can't drink money. And people are going to be starving and thirsty, and that's not that far off. But maybe with certain communication channels we can get ourselves together. If you are not on Mastodon and you are tech savvy, get on Mastodon. If you're not tech savvy, but you understand Twitter, I will recommend to you Blue Sky, which is a Twitter clone. Mastodon is absolutely designed so it cannot be manipulated by oligarchs. Blue Sky is supposedly trying to get to that point. I don't know. I do know it's a lot easier to use than Mastodon, and it certainly has features about it that are better than Mastodon. It's kind of a personal choice. However, you need an invite code. I had to get on Blue Sky. Anybody can sign up for Mastodon It's fairly, well, I won't say it's fairly easy, but just if you do a search, you can find how to sign up for Mastodon. I have some invite codes for Blue Sky. If you're a Patreon supporter, message me on Patreon. I will give you an invite code. When I run out, I run out. And if you're a new Patreon supporter, you will be first in line. No offense to everybody else, but, I need some money. And this is one way for me to get it. So I'm doing that. But, once you're on Blue Sky, whatever you do, it's up to you. You don't have to follow me. It doesn't matter. I can tell you that there's at least 3 podcast listeners to the show on there. And I know that a number of the other atheist podcasts out there have accounts. They just aren't using them yet because they're not sure if Blue Sky will take off. But, as the cesspool that is Twitter gets worse, I would expect them to start using Blue Sky. So anyways, first come, first serve. And next episode I will, depending upon how things are in the world, I will most likely do a normal episode. Although it will be Hex and Hammer, so I'm not really sure if you can call that normal. Anyways, I've sucked up almost 2 hours of your time, and I've got to get to bed, so we'll talk soon.